We're getting very close to Tears of the Kingdom's first anniversary, but even then we've been immersing ourselves in this version of Hyrule for over 7 years now. We've gotten to know this world so very well, with fellow theorists and content creators picking these games apart detail by detail. However, that does not mean there aren't still several mysteries still worth discussing, and one such mystery is the focus of today's video, which ties into both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. It is a question I hear a lot and is often cited as a point of contention among the game's more critical players. I suppose after hearing the discourse about it for long enough, I figured it warranted further serious investigation. The question is as follows. Why did everyone in Hyrule forget about Link between games? He's the hero, right? Tears of the Kingdom is a sequel. We met a great deal of these NPCs and characters in Breath of the Wild. We remember them, but Tears of the Kingdom treats it as though it is the first time that we've ever seen them. Why is that? But honestly, when I played Tears of the Kingdom for the first time, I didn't really get that impression. During the game's early hours, I found myself in Lookout Landing and then Hyrule Castle, and running into NPC after NPC that returned from the last game, and they all recognized Link. So what gives? Of course, Lookout Landing is just one settlement. As you explore, you'll find other people in stables, several other towns, and NPCs wandering out and about. And unlike Lookout Landing, it isn't a given that people around the world are going to immediately know who Link is. So here's what I decided to do. I decided that the best way to get to the root of this question is through good old-fashioned data. I decided to find all returning NPCs from Breath of the Wild that show up in Tears of the Kingdom, track them all down on a new save so that it would be our first time speaking, and sort them into 4 groups. Those who explicitly recognize Link, those who explicitly do not recognize or remember Link, those who know of Link, and those who are ambiguous. The first category is simple. If you meet a character and their dialogue states outright that they know Link or remember him, then they go here. That can range from a simple, "Oh, hello Link," to, "Oh, it's you," as long as it's clear that they know him. A good example is Hudson and Ronson. The second category includes any characters that act explicitly as though they do not know Link, which means the usual trimmings of when you meet someone for the first time, such as asking who Link is or introducing themselves to Link, that sort of thing. Category 3 includes characters who know of Link by reputation, or at least have heard of him, but don't know him personally. The last category is one that has a bit more elbow room. The ambiguous category, the scariest of categories. These are characters that do not explicitly state either way if they do or do not remember Link. They do not say anything to indicate that they know him, but they also do not say anything to imply that they don't know him, such as introducing themselves or asking Link who he is. This category is important because that ambiguity means that, depending on player interpretation, it could be read or argued either way, which opens things up for discussion. A discussion which we will have at the end of the video. One more important note, and this is for obvious reasons, but this study only includes returning characters from Breath of the Wild. There are loads of new NPCs in Tears of the Kingdom that weren't in the previous game, such as Pen and a great deal of the Zonai survey team, so they are omitted from this little informal study. With all that said and done, let's get into the data and look at the characters. There are 407 returning NPCs from Breath of the Wild in Tears of the Kingdom that I could find. There are about 10 characters from Breath of the Wild that seem to have vanished between games and therefore do not return, including Cass, and yes, I'm upset about it, but we're focusing on the characters in both games. Of those 407, 14.7% explicitly indicate that they recognize Link. 2.2% know of Link by reputation. 46.9% explicitly do not recognize Link, and 35.9% of them are ambiguous. Sounds like my thesis is about to suffer, until we take a closer look. The nose of category is the smallest one, so let's start there. It consists of only 9 NPCs, that being these 3 Gerudo named Pasha, Risa, and Dina, Grante, aka Grante-san, Garini, Eliza, Tona, Sudri, and Flaxel. Grante is the son of Robbie and Jaren, so it makes sense that he'd know who Link is. But the part that is most funny about him is that he didn't hear about Link from his parents, but rather through Ronson. Grante is employed by Hudson Construction in Tears of the Kingdom, so I guess this also makes sense. Gorini you meet in Lookout Landing, and this dude is just excited to meet a celebrity. I guess he didn't connect the dots about Link being the dude he met at Palmora Ruins in Breath of the Wild. Oh well. In Tears of the Kingdom, Eliza has been kidnapped by the Yiga. Through her dialogue, she clearly knows about Link the hero, but even when Link literally says that that's him, she doesn't believe him, despite recognizing the Master Sword. This one is a bit funny, because she was the one in Breath of the Wild to give the My Hero quest, but given that even when shown the Master Sword, she doesn't believe that the guy standing in front of her is the Link, I don't know if she can be taken seriously. She was a bit weird in Breath of the Wild as well, let's be honest. A similar thing happens with the trio of Gerudo who have heard of Link, but again, don't believe that this guy could possibly be the hero they've heard about. Tona is in the Prince Sidon fan club, and yeah, so am I. She recognizes Link as the guy who helped Sidon, which isn't untrue, I guess. Sudri runs the Gerudo race at the South Oasis and says it's normally open to only Gerudo, but she's heard of Link and she'll make the exception for him. Thanks, Sudri. And finally, there is Flaxel. She's one of the monster control captains and knows of Link by reputation. In Breath of the Wild, she was part of the Gerudo Canyon quest, where you save Sasami's friends from bokoblins. Moving on to the next category, there are 60 characters who explicitly recognize Link. So who falls into this category? Aside from pretty well everyone at Lookout Landing like Carson, Lester, Pura, Robbie, Jaren, etc., and the folks at the castle like Hawes, Olive, and Nobiro, there is of course the main story cast. You've got your sages of course, Tulin, Yonobo, Sidon, and Riju, as well as those immediately closest to them like Bludo, Boliara, Teba and Saki, Kaneli, Hearth, King Dorfan, and Muzu. You get the gist. They of course all remember Link as they should. Same goes for important Sheikah like Impa, Kato, Dorian, and of course Paya. There's also Simon, who was previously Pura's assistant, but now works as a teacher at the Hateno school. They all greet you by name with the familiarity of a friend. Outside of the Sheikah tribe, there's Tracy, who runs the Lucky Clover Gazette, and of course Hudson and Ronson. Almost all of the Zora recognize or remember Link as well, but there are a few exceptions, such as the Zora who came from another domain like Yona, who weren't in Breath of the Wild so they don't count for this study anyways, or are children who end up actually falling into the ambiguous category. We'll come back to the others later. Most of the Koroks in Korok Forest also do recognize Link. Many continue to refer to him as Mr. Hero, just as they did in Breath of the Wild. The ones outside of the forest that we hunt for Korok seeds, on the other hand, don't seem to, but I've chosen to omit them from this study. They are just collectible MacGuffin babies, and don't even get names. I think it would be impossible to say with certainty if they are the same batch of Koroks from the previous game or not, especially given that there are actually 100 more of them in this game. The ones with names in Korok Forest, however, do remember Link, with one big exception that we'll circle back to. Can't forget Master Koga as well, who not only remembers Link, but is pretty angry at him. We fought Koga back in Breath of the Wild, and the only reason he is down here in the depths now is because we knocked him down there in the last game. Well, sorta. He sorta did it to himself, but it was during our battle with him. Everyone in this category makes complete sense. I don't think any of this needs justification, so let's move on. Next, let's discuss the 191 NPCs who explicitly do not recognize Link. The only returning Zora who don't recognize Link are May, whose head seems to be so in the clouds that she's literally gone missing twice because she was so distracted fishing, and Capson, who we previously had recruited for Terrytown. But man, is he an old geezer, so who knows how his memory is holding up. 74 NPCs are Gerudo. 12 of them are divided among the 3 categories of recognizing, knowing of, and ambiguous. The other 62 of the 74 fall into this category of explicitly not recognizing Link. However, we can immediately account for them. Of course, it makes sense that these Gerudo would not recognize Link, as he was always disguised while in Gerudo Town. The other 12 are characters at Karakara Bazaar and Riju and Boliara, who I already mentioned. So this makes perfect sense. I don't think we need to dwell on this group any longer. There are 40 NPCs who are children. Kids are, frankly, not likely to remember a guy they met several years ago one time. Here's a true story. Once as a kid, I was at my uncle's wedding, and a guy came up to me and frankly scared the crap out of me. I hid behind my dad, who proceeded to chastise said strange man for spooking me. As it turns out, that strange man was actually my other uncle, who was simply there for his brother's wedding. I didn't recognize my own uncle because it had been several years since I had seen him, and I was a little kid. He wasn't a part of my daily life. For many of these kids in Hyrule, the time between games is like half their lifetime ago. Just look at how much Coco has grown between games. Even still, 20 of these kids fall into the ambiguous category, and there are 3 children who do recognize Link. These 2 Gorons, Slurgo and Offrak, who know Link as Yonobo's friend, and Tulin, of course, he's the best. Accounting for the 4 NPCs who are both Gerudo and children, that gives us a group of 13 who don't recognize Link. So that's 75 characters accounted for. Gerudo and kids who don't recognize Link. Who else is there to discuss? There are 45 stable hands and stable employees. Of those 45, 28 of them do not recognize Link. There are also 25 shopkeepers aside from the Gerudo that we already accounted for, and of those 25, only 10 explicitly do not recognize Link. And then there are another 12 NPCs who are traveling merchants and the like. Of those 12, 5 of them do not explicitly recognize Link. There's also 14 people working at inns. Of those 14, another 5 of them do not recognize Link. Though one of them is the Hotel Oasis Inn found in Gerudo Town, so accounting for that overlap, we'll say that's 4. So that is a group of 47 more characters. And you know what these 47 characters have in common? They are basically retail workers. Now look, I don't know if you've ever worked like a job, particularly a customer-facing job, but let me tell you, working those kinds of jobs, you see so many people in a day that when you're working, they all honestly start to blend together. I can safely say this from experience. I worked various customer service jobs myself for over a decade. The longest job I ever had was at a coffee shop for 6 years, where I had some very regular customers. I saw the same people every morning for years, and I could not tell you any of their names off the top of my head right now, aside from a few particularly memorable exceptions. And honestly, Link is not that memorable a guy. He's a very quiet and reserved dude. Exactly the kind of customer that you're gonna forget about 5 minutes after he leaves the store. That's just how it is. And that same logic can honestly be applied to another batch of 29 NPCs. And those are the travelers, who are not traveling merchants, people just out and about on the road or in the wilderness. In fact, that is the demographic that most people in Hyrule are probably assuming Link falls under, especially because often when you meet people in Breath of the Wild, you have the dialogue options of introducing yourself, and it's usually something akin to, "I'm a traveler." But of those 29 traveler NPCs, 14 of them explicitly do not recognize recognize Link. The rest either do or are ambiguous. So if we were to subtract those shopkeepers, merchants, stable hands, innkeepers, and travelers, that's another 61 characters from our list, accounting for the fact that one of those travelers is Rito and 7 of those stable hands are children, so there's overlap. Subtracting that leaves us 55 left to talk about out of 407 total NPCs. This is starting to not sound so unreasonable. Now, something to note here is that these are their occupations in Breath of the Wild. While many do remain consistent, such as most of the stable hands, there are several NPCs who actually change occupations between games, such as Rito here, who went from being a traveler in Breath of the Wild to working at Yonoboko HQ in Tears of the Kingdom, or this guy Nell, who joined the Zonai survey team. The reason I continue to catalog them based on these old occupations is because those are the jobs they had when they first encountered Link in Breath of the Wild. So it is the basis by which they would recognize Link. It's the memory these characters have to go off of. Most of the remaining 55 NPCs that we haven't discussed yet are villagers. And again, applying the same "he's an unassuming introvert" logic to Link, these all start to make a lot of sense pretty quickly as well. Let's talk about Hateno Village first. Even if we consider that Link had a home in Hateno, it was tucked out of the way, and he probably didn't interact too much with his fellow residents on a day-to-day basis, assuming he was even in the village on a day-to-day basis. Not this Link, who is conversationally adverse.
Spill it, boy. Have the two of you been getting along all right? It's okay, I know. Your silence speaks volumes.
He definitely left that community engagement stuff up to Zelda, who was living in that house in the village by the time of Tears of the Kingdom. Whether you want to assume that they lived together or separately is up to interpretation, but that's not the focus of this video. What is the focus of this video is the fact that Link is an introvert. And I can say from experience, as one myself, that it is pretty normal for introverts to essentially keep to themselves on a day-to-day basis. I have lived in my current townhouse for the better part of about 5 years, and while I certainly have learned the names of all my neighbors' cats and dogs, I could not tell you the names of most of the humans who live in my complex. Link, similarly, assuming he stayed in Hateno, likely existed kind of in the background in this village. Try and think about it this way. If you lived in Hateno around the time of Tears of the Kingdom, who are you more likely to remember seeing around the village? The literal smiling princess of your kingdom who has injected herself into your community and helping rebuild things like schools and stuff like that, or her bodyguard who is always standing stoically 2 meters behind her. Let's keep in mind that these villagers are people with their own lives. They are not following Link around through all of his adventures in the wild. They don't see all of that stuff that he does, and Link being who he is, he doesn't exactly go to lengths to advertise his identity as the chosen hero. He's not the kind to boast. As for the other villages, most people probably aren't paying too much mind to the lone traveler passing through every once in a while. We can even glean from dialogue with characters that do recognize him that Link himself hadn't visited a lot of these settlements for quite some time. Years, perhaps. For example, Teba remarks on how much Tulin has grown since Link last saw him, and yeah, it makes sense. The kind of growth that Tulin and the other children in this game went through doesn't happen overnight. It seems that for Terry Town, Kakariko, Rito Village, Gerudo Town, Zora's Domain, and Goron City, that the last time Link had been to any of these settlements was shortly after the end of Breath of the Wild. And the rest of that time between games was spent either traveling with Zelda or splitting his time between Hateno and Lookout Landing. As for the original Sheikah residents of Kakariko, Rolla, Ulken, Steen, Kotla, and Laslie are the only ones who explicitly don't know Link. Laslie and Rolla are shopkeepers and are lumped in with that group I mentioned earlier. Kotla is a little kid, so we already touched on that logic as well. Ulken and Steen are old geezers who are pretty preoccupied with bickering amongst each other. And honestly, even in Breath of the Wild, they never actually get close to Link either. In Breath of the Wild, Ulken only ever believes that you are a fan of the legendary swordsman, not that you actually are him. And Link, again being the kind not to boast, never corrects him. Goron City's population is surprisingly made up almost entirely of those ambiguous characters. The only characters found here in Breath of the Wild that don't remember Link in Tears of the Kingdom are Dugby, who is a child, Ramela the Gerudo jewel trader who is here on business, Rogaro the shopkeeper, Rohan the blacksmith, and a few other shop owners and miners. People who are working. The stables are a bit of a weird case. We've already touched on most of the stable workers, but specifically the stable masters. When visiting a stable for the first time, if you haven't visited any previous stable yet in Tears of the Kingdom, regardless of which one you go to first, the stable master will ask you for your name and create you a new membership, which would place them in category 2. They don't recognize Link, even though they're still taking care of my horses from Breath of the Wild. This only happens during your first stable visit though. After visiting at least one, every other stable master will recognize Link immediately. Regardless, I have marked all of these stable masters that are behind the counter as not recognizing Link. Initially, I only had one of them allocated to this spot, with the rest in the category of recognizing him, but it seems that they only recognize Link because of his new stable association membership, not because of our prior adventure. So in other words, they recognize him from our actions in Tears of the Kingdom, not from those of Breath of the Wild. Still though, we can lump these guys in with the customer service stuff that I mentioned earlier, which applies to all of the other stable workers. Some other noteworthy characters to discuss in this category. Pikongo was someone I was quite looking forward to seeing again. He was one of my favorite characters in Breath of the Wild, initially found at Kakariko Village and after that at stables. In that game, he would offer directions to Link based on photographs, providing a great deal of help to new players that were hunting down memories. Unfortunately, he seems to not recognize Link. This is the first one I have very little justification for, aside from saying, hey, people forget people all the time, I guess, right? Maybe I overestimated the friendship between them in Breath of the Wild. In real life, I have certainly been asked for directions to places, but I don't think I'd commit any of those people to memory. Maybe Pikongo feels the same way, or maybe he's just too wrapped up in his paintings. Hard to say. The horned statue also does not seem to recognize Link, though he does make mention of his time in Hateno, but who knows who this guy even is aside from some sort of evil deity that the goddess imprisoned in a statue. Who knows if he can even tell mortals apart, or what his perception of the world even is. Either way, his dialogue comes off as incredibly self-absorbed. He talks about himself for quite a long while. Who knows how much he's paying attention to who he's actually talking to. And finally, I saved this one for last in this category, but Hestu not recognizing Link is an instance that I have pretty much zero explanation for. I tracked down 900 Koroks for you in the last game, you little shit. I'm just going to chalk it up to him having only one brain cell, and it is consumed by his desire to dance and fear of Evermeans, I guess. And that's that category. And covering that category, for the most part, with a couple of those noteworthy mentions near the end, I think pretty much all of them actually make a lot of sense. So let's talk about the ambiguous category next, which consists of 146 NPCs. First, everyone's favorite merchant, Beetle. When you first speak with Beetle in Tears of the Kingdom, he says, "Hey there, are you a fellow traveler on the journey of life? It's me, Beetle. If you forget, my beetle-shaped pack is right here to remind you." And then he goes on to describe shop-related stuff that he'll buy and sell with you, etc. Beetle is an interesting case, and I've placed him in the ambiguous category. The first box of dialogue implies category 2, that he does not recognize Link, but then his second text box implies category 1, that he does. He poses a weird question about the journey of life, but then says, "It's me, Beetle," which is something you'd say to someone that maybe you know at least vaguely, but maybe aren't close with. Maybe Beetle said this because he recognized Link but was worried Link forgot him. Maybe he's just being coy. This is a weird one, and I feel it legitimately could be argued either way, hence ambiguous category. Bolson is another common sticking point for people as well, but I have similarly marked him in the ambiguous category. Bolson never takes the time to ask Link who he is or anything like that, and the closest thing we get to an introduction from him is some pretty typical coy remarks like, if only those monsters weren't there, master builder that I am, I'd have those buildings fixed up in a jiffy. And don't worry, I may not look it, but I know a thing or two about construction, which is a line he actually says to Rosal, not Link. Again, it could be argued either way. It's unclear if he greets Link with a lot of familiarity per se, but he also doesn't ask Link who he is or introduce himself to Link, hence he is in the ambiguous category. I know people are going to take issue with this placement, but it doesn't bother me all that much, because I find that ambiguity leans more towards familiarity than not. Still, I remember seeing someone online remark something to the effect of, but we were at the same wedding, we had a moment, when talking about Bolson. But no, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but you didn't. You didn't have a moment together. Bolson had a moment. Link stood there expressionless while Bolson was celebrating. That's not having a moment. Regardless, Bolson's dialogue in Tears of the Kingdom never really indicates either way that he knows Link or that he doesn't. He instead is focused on the task at hand, which is the pirates attacking Lorelin and then the reconstruction of the village. In fact, that focus on what is going on here and now, instead of things that happened years ago, is a common theme among characters in this category. Magda is a character that garnered quite a reputation among Breath of the Wild players, being affectionately nicknamed Flower Blight Ganon by the community. She too falls into the ambiguous category. Reviewing all of her dialogue, she actually never acknowledges Link at all. Poor guy is just standing there as an observer of the conversation between her and Isra. It's funny actually, Pen will even ask Link if he's met her before, and he doesn't answer, but Magda never actually talks directly to Link. That is, unless Link goes and steps on her flowers, at which point she will scold him for doing so, though never flying into a fit of rage like in the last game. Magda is weird, but she gives us nothing to go off of, so she sits squarely in the ambiguous zone. I was going to mark the Great Fairies down as ambiguous since they don't really seem to indicate much either way initially, and just talk about the Stable Trotter's music, but then after your first enhancement with Terra, the first Great Fairy, she calls Link a resourceful hero, which seems pretty specific to Link. Not a resourceful traveler, not a resourceful guy, but a hero. So that one changed to a yes. Kotera and Miha remain ambiguous however, but Kesa is a definite yes as well. Let's talk about the Gorons. I mentioned before that most of the Gorons are ambiguous, but something to note is that the first time we meet a lot of them in Tears of the Kingdom, they are not exactly of sound mind. Most of them are frankly not sober, so I had to take into account their dialogue both before and after the Fire Temple is complete, and I think that plays into the ambiguity here. But the ones that really matter here, like Yunobo and Bluto, and even these two kids, do know Link, so I'm not worried about it. And finally, let's talk about the groups who we've kind of touched on a little bit in other categories that end up in the ambiguous category. You've got your stable workers, shopkeepers, etc. So many of these people fall into the ambiguous zone, and it could be read as customer service politeness or a small element of familiarity. It could be argued either way. As customer service workers, they might recognize Link but still address him in a polite way because they're doing their job, or they could not recognize Link but again still just be addressing him in a polite way, just doing their jobs. It could go either way, hence ambiguous. So now that we've looked at the data, we can start to review what we've learned and ask some questions. A big one for me, based on the sheer amount of characters in that final category, was why is it written with such ambiguity? Why is it so unclear with so many characters whether or not they know Link? I think there are a few reasons the writers of the game may have taken this approach. First, avoiding redundancy. It's fine for the first portion of the game when we're getting settled back into Hyrule after our time in the sky, and it even plays into the story that people know Link here, but can you imagine just how much the dialogue would drag on after a few hours of gameplay if every character had to stop and say, hey, I know you, you're Link. Hey Link, remember me? I know you. Remember that time we had this one interaction in the last game? I know you, Link. Before just getting on with whatever they have to say here now. I already feel like there's way more dialogue in this game than in Breath of the Wild, and I think if they had kept that in for every single one of these hundreds of NPCs, that it would get tiresome and repetitive. So they might have just trimmed out those sections of familiarity and cut to the chase. Second, there's a good chance that there are players who did not play Breath of the Wild but are now playing this game. Having characters reference the past game too much for every little traveler they run into or side quest they did could start alienating players and make them feel like they're missing context that isn't important. Don't get me wrong, for important characters, it absolutely makes sense for them to mention that they recognize Link, but for everyone else, it's fat to be trimmed. And third, story focus. I think this logic extends to more than just the NPCs remembering Link, but other aspects of Breath of the Wild's story stuff as well. But in general, the characters we meet around Hyrule are more focused on the various crises and problems that they are facing here and now, rather than talking about stuff that happened to them several years ago. And yes, several years have to have passed between the games. I've heard people say that they think it's been as little as 1 or 2 years, but frankly, that's impossible. The children who return from Breath of the Wild have aged up too much. Hudson and Ronson got married in Breath of the Wild and now have a kid who is old enough to be able to read and write. It's got to have been 5 years minimum, in my view, but probably a little more. Point is, it doesn't make any sense for NPCs to be narrowly focused on or to be still talking about a single interaction they had or a favor that someone did for them several years after the fact when there is a potentially world-ending event on their doorstep. With those points in mind, it could very easily be argued that everyone who falls into the ambiguous category actually does recognize Link to at least some degree, because they don't behave in any way to indicate that they're meeting him for the first time. And the reason I say that is because for many characters in Breath of the Wild, when you meet them for the first time in that game, they do behave in such a way, and often do introduce themselves. Compare the dialogue of meeting this character, Tatsuna, between both games. In Breath of the Wild, she introduces herself because it's the first time meeting Link. In Tears of the Kingdom, she skips that and just launches into talking about whatever she's doing. I'm not saying she definitely knows Link, but I am saying that it could be argued as much. And the fact that there are so many characters with dialogue deliberately written to indicate that certain characters don't know Link, the lack of that dialogue for those ambiguous characters does raise an eyebrow for me. If that were the case, combining those two categories would actually make it the largest group at 206 characters. We also have to ask ourselves, why do we expect every single person to know who Link is? The important ones do, and that makes sense, but for everyone else, why do we carry that expectation? We, in real life playing the game, know Link and everything he's done because we play as Link. We literally went through those experiences with him. These characters, in-universe, have their own lives and live in a very messy, chaotic world. They are not following Link around on his journey like we are. Let's also remember how word gets around, how news spreads. Hyrule's first newspaper just began publication. Before that, the closest thing they had was a series of handwritten books that floated around between stables called Rumor Mill. Aside from that, the kingdom had word of mouth as their news source. So images of Link and the tales of the things that he had done were not exactly in circulation. Newspapers are a brand new thing. And while I touched on this earlier, I think the biggest thing to remember here is that Link is not the sort to boast. He's not in this for fame or recognition, and he never seeks as much. In fact, there's this moment in Breath of the Wild's DLC where Tracy of Rumor Mill, later the Lucky Clover Gazette, actually witnesses Link taking down down the King Molduga, and she asks to write a piece about him, and he actively declines the publicity. He doesn't want the notoriety. It's not even a dialogue option. Link declines the publicity no matter what you do. I get the impression that in-universe Link honestly is just not that memorable a guy. He's a very quiet and reserved character. He hardly speaks even to the people that he's close with, instead choosing to silently bear the burdens of his responsibility. We know all of this from Breath of the Wild, so between limited interactions, characters simply not being exposed to the things Link does most of the time, and Link shying away from the spotlight, I honestly think that this distribution of characters makes a lot of sense. Let's also ask ourselves if we expect everyone to remember Link, who by all appearances seems to be just a regular traveler. Are we holding up a double standard? I mean, do you remember Benny or Dilly? You probably saved his life in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Do you remember him honestly? Well, guess what? He might remember you. He's in the Ambiguous category. To end this off, I'm going to tell you a couple of true stories. I mentioned earlier in the video that I worked at a coffee shop for many years. For those who don't know, I live in the Greater Vancouver area in Canada, which is sometimes known as Hollywood North because of the sheer amount of movies and TV shows that get filmed here. When I worked in that coffee shop, we were actually pretty close to some regularly used film sets, and so we'd see a lot of business from those lots. I would find out after the fact several times that I served coffee to literal celebrities without even knowing it, or even recognizing them. In fact, I once served coffee to the two main guys from the show Supernatural, Jared Padalecki and Jensen Ackles. I was well aware at the time that this show existed. I didn't live under a rock, and I was also aware that it was in production nearby. But when they came in for coffee one day, they were just a couple of faces in a lineup, and they weren't announcing to the world who they were or looking for recognition either. They were just trying to get coffee, and I was just doing my job moving the line through. Celebrities are people, and sometimes people seen outside of the context of what they're known for can be harder to recognize. On the flip side, I do distinctly remember having this one regular customer who I was quite friendly with. I served this lady coffee every day for years, and we got fairly well acquainted. One day I ran into them at the farmer's market. I went and said hello and made friendly small talk before going and finishing my shopping. She was a bit awkward, but I figured I had just caught her off guard or something. But then the next day she came in for coffee and saw me and immediately got super embarrassed. She explained to me that seeing me the day prior with no apron and not behind a counter, she had completely not recognized me and thought some strange guy she didn't know had just struck up conversation with her out of the blue. We had a good laugh about it once we were on the same page, but it really goes to show you how much context matters when it comes to recognizing people, even people you see every day. And that's where we're going to wrap up this video. I hope you found this look at Tears of the Kingdom characters to be enlightening, or at least somewhat interesting. This project was a monumental undertaking, so hopefully it was worth the watch. Before anyone decides to go and comment about the copium of this video in the comments section, I hope you'll take a moment to get introspective about it first. By the way, I didn't want this video to drag on too long. It's already got quite the runtime. I tried to touch on as many of these characters as possible in a reasonable way, but if there's any characters that I didn't talk about that you're curious about or just want more details on, I do have a massive 30-some odd page spreadsheet with notes on every single one of the NPCs that I collected data on for this little study, so feel free to leave me a comment below and let me know if you're curious about anything. But for the sake of flow and runtime, I hope you understand not everyone could get a dedicated mention. Anyways, friends, thank you so much for watching and for the patience you've given me in the time that it took to come out with this video. And special thanks goes to my patrons and channel members, including Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, and Stefan, as well as all of the other names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I truly hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.